This time, the topic was what Christians believe. And what he's doing here is he's trying to look at what he would call mere Christianity. As much as possible to look at the things that all Christians, Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, would be able to agree upon. But he begins this in terms of what Christians believe by helping distinguish what Christians believe from other religious systems. And the first series was entitled The Rival Conceptions of God. And he begins this way. And again, it's very classic Lewis, and it has everything to do with his background, where he was and where he came to. I've been asked to tell you what Christians believe, and I'm going to begin by telling you one thing that Christians do not need to believe. If you are a Christian, you do not have to believe that all other religions are simply wrong all through. If you are an atheist, you do have to believe that the main point in all the religions of the whole world is simply one huge mistake. If you are a Christian, you are free to think that all these religions, even the queerest ones, contain at least some hint of the truth. When I was an atheist, I had to try to persuade myself that most of the human race have always been wrong about the question that mattered to them most. When I became a Christian, I was able to take a more liberal view. But of course, being a Christian does not mean thinking that where Christianity differs from other religions, Christianity is right and they are wrong. Of course, that's what it does mean. Because again, Lewis believes in objective truth. There's an objective right and an objective wrong. And where the two differ, and Christianity believes, and he has reasons for it, comes down on the right side. He says the first big division of humanity is into the majority who believe in some kind of God or gods and the minority who do not, which he talked about earlier. On this point, Christianity lines up with the majority, as I've already alluded to. Now, I go on, he says, to the next big division. People who all believe in God can be divided according to the sort of God that they believe in. There are two very different ideas on the subject. One of them is the idea that He, that is God, is beyond good and evil. We humans call one thing good and another thing bad, but according to some people, that is merely our human point of view. Everything is good in one way and bad in another, and that nothing could have been different. Consequently, these people think that long before you and I got anywhere near the divine point of view, the distinction would have disappeared between good and evil. The other and the opposite idea is that God is quite definitely good or righteous, a God who takes sides, who loves love and hates hatred, and who wants us to behave in one way and not in another. The first of these views, the one that thinks God is beyond good and evil, is called Pantheism. It was held, as far as I can understand them, by Hindus and others related to it. The other view is held by Jews, Muslims, and Christians. And having lived in India, I could take some time to explain that more in terms of how that plays out in the everyday Hindu life, but I don't have time to do it. But it does. Those two things begin to blur. Now, he says, if you think some things really bad and God really good, then you cannot talk like that. That is, like a pantheist. You must believe that God is separate from the world and that some of the things we see in it are contrary to His will. Confronted with a cancer or a slum, the pantheist can say, if you could only see it from the divine point of view, you would realize that this also is God. The Christian replies, don't talk damn nonsense. Now remember his audience. It thinks God made the world, that space and time, heat and cold, and all the colors and tastes, and all the animals and vegetables are things that God made up out of His head as a man makes up a story. But it also thinks that a great many things have gone wrong. with the world that God made, and that God insists, and insists very loudly, on putting them right again. Now, this contrast in terms of a pantheistic view of things and what we might call a Christian worldview, that notion plays itself out in terms of the whole notion of salvation as well. For a Hindu, the only escape is to escape from the story completely. So salvation or nirvana is ceasing to exist as an individual I. You're merged in the all-pervasive reality of Brahman. It's like a drop of water going into the ocean. It's gone. There's no more I or self. And the concept, the Christian concept of salvation, to them is an abomination. Because it talks about an immortal, forever embodied state. And that's the very thing they're trying to be saved from. They're not, two roads going to the same direction. They're going into opposite directions. And they don't have any problem with that, folks. It's just us here in the West that have a problem. We're so insecure that we got to make sure that everybody really is included in going in the same direction. And if they're not, then somehow we feel something's out of kilter. But the rest of the world really doesn't have that kind of hang-up. Lewis goes on. And of course, that raises a very big question. If a good God made the world, why has it gone wrong? The question of evil, the problem of evil. My argument against God, when he was an atheist, Lewis says, was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe to? How was I coming to a point of saying it was unjust? If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, why did I, who was supposed to be part of the show, find myself in such violent reaction against it? If I'm part of it, like a tree, like a bird, a dog, why can't I accept the show? Why do I take this step outside, as it were, of the show and render a judgment on the show when I'm a part of that show? He says, a man feels wet when he falls into the water because man is not a water animal. A fish would not feel wet. Again, his point. Of course, I could give up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed. For the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust. So I can't be a God. Not simply that it did not happen to please my private fancies. Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, in other words, that the whole reality was senseless, I found I was forced to assume that one part of the reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sense. Consequently, atheism turns out to be too simple. If the whole universe has no meaning, we should never have found out that it has no meaning, because we're just part of the show. He made a statement when he was a young lad. Shows you how precocious he was in these things. He struggled, he said, while he maintained that God did not exist, he was also angry with God for not being there. And was equally angry for creating the world that he did. He called it a world of contradictions that he lived in, that he could not resolve. So that was the end of the first broadcast talk on what Christians believe, trying to sort out what they don't believe and basically what they do in a very broad way. He named the second one the invasion. Very well then, atheism is too simple, and I will tell you another view that is also too simple. It is the view I call Christianity in water. The view which simply says there is a good God in heaven and everything is all right. Leaving out all the difficult and terrible doctrines about sin and hell and the devil. and redemption. And he's basically taking a shot at liberal Protestant theology that says the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of all mankind, and we're really all getting better. Karl Barth, the great German theologian who believed this, found that he could not maintain it while he was preaching to widows in his church in Switzerland. The whole experiment in World War I was that the West now has thrown off religion, thrown off superstition. We're getting bigger and better into this utopian society. And what did it lead to? Them killing one another in the most atrocious war. We're getting bigger and better. He couldn't preach this stuff anymore. This liberal, everything's okay idea. Lewis went through that war and was wounded in the trenches. He understood that experience. He says it is no good asking for a simple religion. After all, real things are not simple. They look simple, but they are not. If you want to go on and ask what is really happening, then you must be prepared for something difficult. If we ask for something more than simplicity, it is silly then to complain that something more is not simple. I can remember an old prof telling me that God never put the cookies on the lower shelf. And that's one of our problems as Christians, is we're intellectually weak, even us. We do not want to work very hard at understanding the world that we're in. But there's no way around it, and that's what Lewis is pointing to. Very often, he said, people put up a version of Christianity suitable for a child of 6 and make that the object of their attack. When you try to explain the Christian doctrine as it really is held by an instructed adult, they begin to complain that you're making their heads turn round and that it is all too complicated, and that if there really were a God, then he would surely have made religion simple. Do you see? You can't win with them. They put up some simple view of Christianity and shoot it down. So you say, but that's not real Christianity. So you go into it and they say, now it's too complicated. And God wouldn't do that in the first place. And what he responds in saying to this is, notice their idea of God making religion simple, as if religion was something God invented, and not his statement to us of certain quite unalterable facts about his own nature. It is what it is. Besides being complicated, reality in my experience is usually odd. It is not neat, not obvious, not what you expect. Chesterton puts it this way: truth, of course, must of necessity be stranger than fiction, for we made fiction to suit ourselves. Reality, in fact, Lewis goes on, is usually something you could not have guessed. That is one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons I believe in Christianity. It is a religion you could not have guessed. If it offered us just the kind of universe we had always expected, I should feel we were making it up. But in fact, it is not the sort of thing anyone would have made up. It has just that queer twist about it that real things have. So let us leave behind all these boys' philosophies, these over-simple answers. The problem is not simple, and the answer is not going to be simple either. Now let me just allude to something here. In terms of the development of Christian thinking, and this idea of complexity. I can remember my first early theology classes, and the kind of school I was in at the time. They were real good at calling people heretics. You know, that they didn't believe in the Trinity as we understand it now, so heretic. But what I began to realize as I began to read through those documents through the first 5 centuries of the church, is that the church, by about the 3rd century, began to have some freedom to begin to express itself, and the world around it called it to account and said, explain yourself, tell us what you believe. And one of the things the church had been doing for those 3 centuries was worshiping Jesus as God. Before it was actually a formal document, it was a part of their praxis, their experience. It was what they inherited. But now they need to explain this, because the Christians were accused of 3 things. They were cannibals, they were immoral, And they were atheists. They were cannibals because they did this weird thing of eating and drinking Jesus' body and blood. They were immoral because they used to go behind doors into these love feasts, as they called them, which was really the breaking of bread. And they give each other a holy kiss as they went in. And folks, that was a real kiss, not some peck on the cheek. And they were atheists because they did not believe in the pantheon of gods. So they said, "What do you believe?" Okay, now you have this problem of saying, okay, we believe in a God that's one, but we've been worshiping and acknowledging Father, Son, Holy Spirit. How do you do that? How do you express that? Do you see the problem? Nobody would have asked for that kind of issue. And so they tried things. Justin Martyr, who is not a heretic, he's just working really hard at trying to understand these. He says, well, maybe if we look at the Son, let's say he's like the embryo in the Father, who's sort of always there in potential, and then at the point of creation, he leaps from the bosom of the Father, becomes an individual sort of thing, one with the Father, and does his thing. I say, well, that's good, but it's not quite there. You see what's going on here? It's a very complicated thing. And it took them to 325 and 381 to sort of sort that out, and they never explained it, they just described it. Once they got that, they said, okay, now we say that one of these actually became a human being without ceasing to be God, but a fully human. Whew. What do we do with that? Do you see what they were up against? It was very, very difficult. And that's what Lewis is saying here. Life is not simple. God is not simple. And to say what we believe is not going to be simple either. Now, he says, what is the problem? A universe that contains much that is obviously bad and apparently meaningless, but containing creatures like ourselves who know that it is bad and meaningless. There are only two views that seem to face all the facts. One is the Christian view that is that this is a good world that has gone wrong but still retains memory of what it ought to have been. The other is the view called dualism. Dualism means the belief that there are two equal, independent powers at the back of everything, one of them good, the other bad, and that the universe is a battlefield in which they fight out an endless war. He says, these two powers are spirits, one good and bad. There's a catch to that idea, though. One, an inconsistency, one that he had difficulty with. They're supposed to be quite independent. They both existed from all eternity. Neither of them made the other. Neither of them has any more right than the other to be called God. Each presumably thinks it's good and thinks the other bad. Otherwise, they wouldn't be warring. One of them likes hatred and cruelty. The other likes love and mercy. And each backs its own view. Now, this is a real view. He's bringing it down to communicate to ordinary people. Now, what do we mean when we call one of them a good power and the other bad? It certainly isn't inherent in that worldview, you see? Because if that's really true, then those are the two great realities, and those are the things that are. And they themselves do not call this a moral issue in the way that we do. We look at them and we're trying to sort this out, and so we make the distinction and we say one's good and one's bad. Now, what Lewis goes on to say is, what makes us call one good and one bad? Where does that come from? Well, it doesn't come from these two things. So there must be something prior to that. So we're back to the same place. He summarizes it this way, but the moment you say that you are putting into the universe a third thing in addition to the two powers, some law or standard or rule of good which one of the powers conforms to and the other fails to conform to, exists. But since the two powers are judged by this standard, then this standard or the being who made this standard is farther back, higher up than either of them, and he will be the real God. In fact, what we meant by calling them good and bad turns out to be that one of them is in the right relation to the ultimate God and the other one is in the wrong relationship. And we're back to a view that's very different than dualism. He says the same point can be made in a different way. Goodness is, so to speak, itself. Badness is only spoiled goodness. There must be something good first before it can be spoiled. Even to be bad is to borrow or steal from some opponent. And do you now begin to see why Christianity has always said that the devil is a fallen angel? That is not a mere story for children. It is a real recognition of the fact that evil is a parasite, not an original thing. The powers which enable evil to carry on are powers given it by goodness. That is why dualism, in a strict sense, will not work. In other words, if you look at things, bad can become worse. But bad doesn't move to good. Bad is always some movement away from the good, a perversion. Certainly that is true in our experience. But Lewis goes on, but I freely admit that real Christianity, as distinct from Christianity in water, goes much nearer to dualism than some people think. Christianity agrees with dualism that this universe is at war. But it does not think that this is a war between independent powers. It thinks it is a civil war, a rebellion, and that we are living in that part of the universe occupied by the rebel. Let me say that again. It's more like a civil war, and that we are living in the part of the universe occupied by the rebel. Enemy-occupied territory. That is what this world is. Christianity is the story of how the rightful king has landed, you might say, landed in disguise and is calling us all to take part in a great campaign of sabotage. When you go to church, you are really listening in to the secret wireless from our friends. Now, that probably goes over our heads here, but if you put yourself during World War II in the middle of Britain, it makes all the sense in the world. That is why the enemy is so anxious to prevent us from going to church. I know someone will ask me, do you really mean at this time of day to reintroduce our old friend the devil? And it goes on even with the tail and stuff, and Lewis says, well, I don't know about that. But he says, my answer is, yes, I do. I do not claim to know anything about his personal appearance. If anybody really wants to know him better, I would say to that person, don't worry, if you really want to, you will. Whether you like it when you do is another question. Now, at this point, I should note, in 1947, Lewis's face was on the cover of Time magazine. He was news, big news, because he was a heretic. And do you know what his heresy was? Orthodoxy. An Oxford professor who really believed in these things. That was news in 1947.